What is this plant? I'm very surprised. It looks like very primitive pteridophyte or something like sphenophyte, like a horse tails from the primary era. But actually, when we look, we see the vines along the midrib of each leaf, so it's obviously a dicotyledon. But is it the young stage of a tree? Is it a shrub? Which kind of family it could be, no idea at all. I've never seen something like that with a so long internodes without any leaf. And so many leaves crowded together at one node, or what's something which looks like one node only. So I hope we'll see a little bit more things about this creature in Danum Valley, because we just arrived now in Danum Valley. We see this so strange plant. Obviously this is a dicotyledon. It has totally verticillate leaves growing in a flush all together, exactly the same age, and long part of the stems with only very small cataphyls. It has a terminal inflorescence with many small flowers. Impossible to know what this could be. Inflorescence is so strange. These are very small ball-shaped flower buds, much branched inflorescence, contrary to the plant itself. So here we see some two juvenile. It seems it's really growing in the forest understory, and especially on the slopes close to the water. After emerging and flowering when about 4 or 5 meters tall. The trunk, which is really covered by spines, accreting spines, because they become longer and longer. Quite often they are by 2, but it's not necessarily. So many families can have spines, rutescens, so many Forbiaceae, Rhamnaceae. It's not a good indication. It seems about the maximum size of the trunk, about 10 centimeters in diameter, and in height it can reach about 6 or 8 meters. It seems never more, because flowering even at 2 meters tall. So here we see some young stages of this plant. So when young like this, the leaves are not yet perfectly whirled. So regeneration seems very good in this area. We see some bigger ones. This one has already the successive whorls of leaves. Oh, and a beautiful orchid also. Wow. Wow, 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 wow. Ooh, ooh. It's so bright yellow. Ooh. Là, c'est magnifique. when we see this, it seems we came back to the primary era with the huge sphenophytes, especially the huge calamites, or even in understory, the Sphenophyllum, so which did disappear for most of them since the end of the Carboniferous time. Of course, it's not at all this group, it's a dicotyledon, but very totally mimicking the growth habit of these primitive sphenophytes. It means that actually to have verticillate leaves like this, even if it's very ancient, concerning the adaptive way, it's not so primitive about adaptation. Here is a shrubby begonia species. It's a little bit branched, not so much, but few lateral stems, and with of course totally plagiotropic stems, perfectly disticus leaf arrangement. And what is quite remarkable is that the flowers are really tiny flowers. We see here a small male flower. The male flower is open. We see the stamens in the center on the two lateral tepals. The fruit is quite big. Oh yes, actually the fruit, we can see here there were two female flowers, and we see actually the fruit which becomes quite a big size. Everywhere we see there were two female flowers and a terminal male branch inflorescence. So two female, and many small male flowers. So the female flowers which give the dry capsular fruits, three-winged, typical of the begonia species. The section of the genus is probably Petermania due to the two female flowers at the base of each inflorescence. So the young developing capsular fruits, three-winged. So of course we see that the female flowers are flowering before the male flowers. In this plant, of course, to have fecundation efficient, it means that in other places male flowers are flowering at the same time as female. Here we see the female flower. Already all the wings of the ovary are perfectly developed, and we see that the tepals are not yet opening, so it's still the stage of flower bud. After it will open, I think there are maybe 3 or 5 tepals, contrary to the male flowers which have only 2 tepals. So here in the Danum Valley Conservation Area, we are along the Danum River, and here on this tree we see this orchid. It's there are quite many groups like Appendicula, this group of orchids which has long stems and perfectly around leaves along the stem, inflorescence at the end. So of the stem, this is one thing, perfectly disticus. We see really in one plane, plagiotropic disticus. And here, something a little bit not so common, it's a medinilla. And what is not so common actually is that we are 100 meters above sea level, and we know that medinilla, the epiphytic species, are mostly in mountains everywhere in Asia. For instance, in Mount Kinabalu, around 1,500 meters, there are maybe 12 or 15 species. So here is a lowland medinilla. It has very thick leaves because it can withstand quite a dry period, because of course on Mount Kinabalu it's much more humid all the year round, but here it's not the case. So we see the small inflorescence, the small flower with a reddish, pinkish, orange epanthium, so the part just below the petals, and we see that the petals are white. So it's not one of the most showy species of medinilla, but it's a nice plant. Under this more or less horizontal branch of a huge shorea, we see totally crowded an epiphytic pandanus species. Before it was always considered it was only one species, Pandanus epiphyticus, now in the genus Benstonea, but anyway it's a Pandanus insulato. But now we know actually that between Peninsular Malaysia, Sarawak, Sabah, other parts of Borneo, there are different species of epiphytic pandanus, but they have still to be studied. Hanging down from this branch, a climber going down, and it is typically the leaf shape of the pothos. So the leaves are divided into two parts. The proximal part, which is totally winged, and it's actually the sheath of the peciolar sheath, which is totally open. We see when it's still young, we see clearly the sheath covering the apex of the younger leaves. And after, when the blade expands, the sheath opens totally, and it creates this so particular leaf shape, same a little bit like some citrus species, and it's a characteristic of this genus pothos, especially the section Eupothos, the real pothos. Here on the slope just above the Danum River, we see Macaranga, so the genus Macaranga, just as we know, is a genus of pioneer trees, but actually pioneer means they are arriving when something has been destroyed, but otherwise the natural habitat is very often like this along rivers or in big forest gaps. And it's a dioecious genus, and this here we see the long branch inflorescences. It is family Euphorbiaceae, of course, and same as for most Euphorbiaceae, we can see some glands at the top of the petiole, and we see ants which are of course interested by the sugar secretion. The glands have just a little bit swollen structure here, and I try not to fall in the river, but I should like to see more closely. Yes, we see typical flowers of Euphorbiaceae family. So we see them here. I think actually it's a female flowers. Ooh, many ants. And the red structures, the stigmatic structures, the filaments, red filaments are stigmatic structures, and we see the ovary. This small flowering ginger is obviously a Bussenbergia, and actually Bussenbergia and the Scarphoclamis are the two genera with the smallest species on the forest floor among Zingiberaceae. Of course, there are some small global species, but among this group of erect species, Bussenbergia and Scarphoclamis are very small, and this one is very beautiful with the lip which is partly bright dark red and partly white, and we see also just above the labellum the other parts of the flower, the petals and the sepals. Among the epiphytic Zingiberaceae, the most common genus is Hedychium, but of course many Hedychium species are also terrestrial, especially in the Himalayas. But here in equatorial areas like Peninsular Malaysia, South Thailand, Borneo, of course, the Hedychium are never terrestrial, always epiphytic, and this is one of these epiphytic species of Hedychium. On the rock, the small rock, we see Gesneriaceae. It is this group of Gesneriaceae which usually have a quite short lifespan, more or less annual, and very asymmetric leaf base, very asymmetric. And we see the terminal inflorescence, but in this group of Gesneriaceae, I know some species in India, in mainland Asia, but this structure of inflorescence, I've never seen this, and we see the flower, which is a very beautiful dark blue, purple, violet color. The calyx lobes, which are very long, and the calyx is totally embracing the tube of the purple flower. So it's the structure of inflorescence is very, everything is elegant in this plant, absolutely everything. The red stem, the juicy structure, the leaves are almost not eaten by anybody, the structure of the inflorescence growing and growing at the apex, so it's a perfect thing. I did see when arriving, I did see the vines, Acrodromus vines, a little bit parallel. I did think immediately about Melastomataceae family, but while approaching, I see that the leaves are alternate and not at all opposite. And when looking more closely, I see that each leaf has a sheathing special, totally sheathing, and the new leaves arises from the schist, so it is obviously a piper. We see the typical stems, fleshy stems of herbaceous piper, so I'm very surprised because this type of more or less herbaceous piper is very poorly known in Asia, and probably still many species are waiting for the description. And here obviously it is vegetative propagation because the stems are falling on the ground, and of course they have roots all along the stem, just as we can see, and after new stems appear in the older part. So this is a very efficient way for vegetative propagation of this piper, which has a swollen node, typical of the piper species. In this population of the big Alocasia, we see the inflorescence in many of these huge plants, and it's always a problem to know who is Alocasia sarawakensis and who is Alocasia robusta. Actually, due to the fact that the leaves are not at all glaucous on the lower surface, it's supposed to be Alocasia sarawakensis. But problem is that the inflorescence, we see horizontal purple patches which are much more characteristic of Alocasia robusta. So it's not so evident to know who is this guy, and why not a hybrid, I don't know. Oh, the stem is huge, like kind of elephant foot. It's a diameter like this. So here we see side by side the two big species of Alocasia we can find here. This is of course the tallest. This is Alocasia robusta, and we see that the lower side of the leaf is really a little bit bluish, and the vines are very thin, and we see the huge inflorescence which are very thick spadix, and also a beige brown spot. And here we see the more common around here, Alocasia sarawakensis, which is a little bit smaller, and most of all, the lower side of the leaf is totally different. It is green compared to the bluish glaucous lower side of the leaf of Alocasia robusta. It's of course interesting to see side by side the two species. We can see the bright orange small berries, and the fruit is opening, the lower part of the spot is opening exactly like a flower, revealing the bright orange berries eaten by animals. So we see here in Alocasia sarawakensis, that the inflorescence is very different. The upper part of the spadix is yellow and quite narrow. And the spat is much smaller and it is whitish and not at all brownish and crinkled. So totally different structure. On this almost vertical slope, we see a begonia, erect species, which is covering very huge areas, and it is totally erect, a little bit branched, and we see the inflorescence is much branched also at the end of the stems, with so many tiny flowers, mostly male flowers are small, and also we see some fruits of the female flowers. We see all the young individuals, and we see that most of them, when young, have green but silver designed leaves, and after the leaves become more and more green, but already flowering. We see the female flowers, for instance, here with the winged ovary. This begonia is really a small jewel, almost blackish leaf with a silver design on the periphery, and the leaves are totally bullate and with a hair in the center of each bumpy structure. So it's very spectacular. Ginger flowering at the ground level. It's not a huge species. Always difficult to know really which genus it is, but since I don't see huge bracts around the base of the inflorescence, I think maybe this is a Amomum and not Etlingera. Flowers of Heteroblema. It's a really cauliflorus, and this species has quite big flowers. On the forest floor, something oppressed and creeping with almost black leaves. So I want just to check if it's a piper or an aracea. No, actually the venation looks much more like a venation of a piper. So probably this is a young form of a climbing piper, but the color is totally cryptic, impossible to detect on the forest floor. Epiphytic Antrophyum, it is totally fixed to the trunk through this embracing root system, and these roots are very hairy, and actually they create really material like a sponge retaining water and also minerals along the trunk from the rainwater, and it can withstand quite dry period. We can see a frutescens, but this one is very herbaceous, really not spiny. It has adventitious roots. It's climbing on a dead log, but afterwards probably it will be climbing on the tree. But the texture of the leaf is not at all usual for a frutescens. In some ways like the Frutescens elegantula from New Guinea, but it's obviously totally different. Creeping on this branch on the soil, on the ground floor, a ficus, a climbing ficus, which is probably the ficus with the smallest leaves, probably Ficus punctata. It has very oblique, tiny leaves, and with it also is a bigger leaved but much more common Ficus villosa, also climbing, so we see two species together. C'est quelque chose d'assez étonnant quand même ce truc, à un moment. Ah ouais, One more species of Dipterocarp, and we know that the family Dipterocarpaceae here in Danum has more than 150 different species, mostly of course in the genus Shorea, but also Opea, Dryobalanops, Dipterocarpus, and this one is a kerwing, and kerwing is the local name for the Dipterocarpus, and this one has the biggest leaves, and we can see on the forest floor all of these huge leaves with the typical regular parallel venation of the Dipterocarpaceae. It seems that now it's not at all a year where we have mass fruiting in Dipterocarpaceae, because in this Dipterocarp forest we don't see any single fruit on the soil. Here we see an Alocasia princeps, and this is the quite usual size of this plant, growing always on very steep slopes, very often on limestone, but always very well-drained areas, so it's totally different from the huge one we have seen in Kinabatangan, which was more than 2 meters tall and growing in swampy low ground. So here we see something very strange. First, this. So I see immediately it's an Aracea, but what I see, it's totally disticus. So it's probably Monsteroideae in the subfamily or not a pothos. So in Monsteroideae, it could be either a Rhaphidophora or a Syndapsus, but due to the quite huge size of the sheath, I think it's a Syndapsus. But we see actually these two things arising from something totally covered by bark, by Rhytidome. Actually, it's a group of stems, and this one, what is very strange, that usually when new stems emerge, they are climbing at the top, but here we see these incredible things. I mean, these huge stems don't climb, but are going to the ground like stolons, but usually in Aracea like this, it's not stolons, it's flagelliform shoots. I mean, shoots arising from the top and going down, but here they arise from the lower part of the plant, and it is totally protected like roots by this cork, which allows them not to be eaten by animals and also to have some resistance to fire. Here, of course, there is no fire here in Danum, but some resistance to dry periods. We see also the lateral roots fixing the stem, climbing on quite usual Aracea leaves at the top. But I'll follow a little bit what happens underground. So here we see these stems going on the ground floor, so coming from the tree and then growing to give another plant climbing up the tree. So some of these huge stems are going down to the soil, but some others are climbing along the trunk, and much higher they will give the lateral shoots, which are the flowering detached shoots. And we can see the leaves with very long petiole, and this is why I think it is probably a Syndapsus. Again, another species of a ginger growing on the forest floor. I have no idea, of course, about the genus. It seems it's quite small, but I don't think it's a globa. The leaves are velvety and brown. And yes, there is a small swollen part, so maybe it's a zingiber, because just at the base of the petiole it's a little bit swollen, so probably it's a genus zingiber. And so brown velvety leaf, and the lower surface is absolutely astonishing because the color is totally dark, bright purple color, so it's a totally anthocyanins accumulating on the lower surface of the leaf, as usual in forest understory plants. an incredibly beautiful fern, and it is climbing, and also a little bit with somewhat oppressed shingle leaves, but somewhat detached on the very beautiful black vines, climbing here at the top of the small hill, about 300 meters above sea level. And I'm looking for fertile fronds on the, oh yes, I see the fertile frond. So it's climbing, and here we see finally the fertile frond with the sorry totally covering the surface of the lower part. Maybe it could be an elaphoglossum when I see all the sorry covering the whole surface. Early Cretaceous time, so it was when dinosaurs were at the maximum of their success, 120 million years ago, because dinosaurs did disappear 65 million years ago. And this plant already here 120, so double time. It was really the great period for dinosaurs. So probably they did eat a lot of Chloranthus. And it's strange because when you find also some traces of the leaves, it's very similar in the fossils 120 million years ago and now for these living plants. So this is an important plant to know. So I try to look more. First of all, we see these leaves are very, very old because they are totally covered by mosses, algae, probably fungi and bacteria we don't see. But just under this wonderful bright orange flower with the three sepals at the base of the flower, and it seems there are 2 times 3 petals, long hanging petals. So I don't know if it's a Goniothalamus or a related genus. So actually here we see also the small fruit. So what is interesting in the family Ananaceae is that we had only one flower, for instance one flower with the 3 sepals here and partly eaten petals, so one flower, and suddenly when we see the fruit it seems it was an inflorescence because we see many different fruits, but actually it is because the pistils of the flower are all separate from each other and each matures in a single berry, so it's a Semecarpus. It's a special fruit which looks like composed of many flowers, but it's ovaries all separated, arising from the top of this mound inside the base of the flower. This shrub has opposite leaves and very, very long filamentous stipules. So it is clearly a member of the Rubiaceae family, and the inflorescence is actually this hanging down spherical structure. The peduncle is totally recurved. It seems it is at the fruiting stage. Probably it's a group of a Psychotria. Some Psychotria have inflorescence like this, but maybe something totally different. Maybe. One more begonia with very beautiful leaves, because we see that the surface is shiny, but there are tiny dark green dots, and actually these dark green dots are just at the base of a small hair, erect hair, and it's an accumulation of chlorophyll at the base of each of these hairs. So it's why it gives this very dark green structure, and the flowers are hairy and very beautiful. The female flower with a totally hairy ovary, especially on the wings, and we see the pistils, the stigma, which looks exactly like stamens, like in most begonias. Here we can see the male flowers, so the inflorescence with so many tiny male flowers. The head is up or down? The head. Mignon, t'as vu comme il s'accroche. Là, il est impressionnant le petit chien. Dipterocarps. This is a wild native species of musa, a banana, a small species in the forest understory, in a little bit open places, but totally native, and we see it's a species with erect bananas, quite well separated from each other, and the bright orange-red bracts, which don't fall immediately, but they are recurved downward before falling, so it's very, very elegant. It's Musa Beccarii, Eduardo Beccarii, being a botanist who traveled a lot more than 1 century ago in Borneo and collected so many plant species. So in this ginger, actually we see that according to the individuals, there are different patterns of the design. This one, for instance, has not only dark purple splashes, but also along the midvine, it is totally designed. Whereas just 50 centimeters on the left, another individual is very faintly designed. So it's the variability, of course, inside one single species, probably an Etlingera. So here we are on the canopy walkway in the Danum Valley, and I'm just against the huge trunk of the Cumpacia excelsa, one of the tallest trees of the forest, the Leguminosae family. And what is interesting is that the cables have been recently installed, only in 2017, so it means only 5 years ago. And we see actually that the Cumpacia did already cover all the structure put inside its trunk in only 5 years. So Cumpacia has a great ability to cover everything entering the trunk. So it's why when people decide to have ladders to climb along the Cumpacia to collect honey from the bees, it's very safe because the trunk is covering each stick inside the trunk. But I'm very surprised that only in 5 years we see already, and it's good because so it's maintained very strongly all the cables. This hanging epiphyte, I don't know if it's an orchid or maybe the hanging stems of the small Frutescens without spines we have seen in the forest understory, but it's a monocot, that's sure. It's not an Aracea, so maybe an orchid or a frutescens. So on this main branch of a tree, which is about 30 meters above the soil, we see so many epiphytic species. Of course, different orchids with the erect tufted leaves, just under the hanging Esculentus with characteristic opposite leaves well hanging under the branch. The big leaves of Medinella, we see a Schefflera, also an epiphytic Schefflera with quite big rounded leaves on here. So it's a member of Aracea. I see the small spadix. I try not to fall, but here we see the spadix. It is most probably a Syndapsus, which is flowering on the hanging stem. So we see that many plants are hanging here in Borneo. So we have a Aracea, Syndapsus, we have Piper, we have Esculentus, plus all the other epiphytics standing much more erect. When I see this stem with swollen circles all along the stem, of course we can think about the stem of a gnetum, because they have very often circles were like this, but actually when we look a little bit upward, we see that are arising the lateral branches of a Piper species, and we see clearly the shape of the Piper. So it's very interesting to see actually that this Piper was climbing along the trunk and then reaching the main branch and growing, and finally this is one of these plants hanging down on about 10 meters long with all the flowering stems, lateral stems, sympodial stems on each side of the long hanging stem. So we see really a very particular growth habit in the sense that actually this Piper is producing hanging stems. It's not at all usual for the genus. An Edachium, epiphytic Edachium, totally creating a circle around the trunk, and this circle of course allows accumulation of litter of the dead leaves in the middle. So it means that the rhizomes are growing horizontally all around the trunk, creating this perfect shape. So this hanging epiphyte with thick leaves opposite is obviously a member of a Gesneriaceae, and we see the tubular cream, quite big flowers, and the tube is quite wide. Maybe an Agalmilla, because there are many species of climbing Agalmilla and epiphytic, because I'm very surprised to see such a big flower on this type of leaf for an Esculentus, so probably an Agalmilla. another climbing piper, and the leaves are very beautifully designed with the silver patches all along the vines. So it's this group of the climbing, so many species here of climbing piper. When I see this small shrubby plant, I did think it could be a young tree, but actually there are the flowers here at the top of the stem. It has a swollen base of the leaf. Leaves are just a little bit dentate, like hydatodes. The flowers have 5 separate petals. We see all the stamens are on a kind of column in the center, so maybe it could be related to the Bombaceae, I mean to Malvaceae sensulato, but maybe something totally different. So here, this small plant with venation, which is very striking, and it's actually, when I look at the flowers and mostly at the small fruits, which are totally boat-shaped fruits, actually it is clearly an Ophiorrhiza in the family Rubiaceae. But usually Ophiorrhiza are growing on steep slopes close to waterfalls, but this species is growing on the forest floor. So it's very unusual for an Ophiorrhiza. So this plant is between herb and shrub. It's difficult to decide because the stem is erect but totally green and juicy. We see the stipule, so no doubt it is a Rubiaceae, and we see the inflorescences with the ovary and calyx. Probably it will produce quite a big berry at the base of each flower. So here I go through a huge ficus which has so many pillars. Probably it was strangling at the beginning, or maybe it has roots arising from lateral branches of the host tree before killing it, but now we see there are maybe 10, 20 pillars, huge pillars, and even now there are still some younger roots like this, for instance, which is creating in the future one more pillar. So it's a little bit between banyan habit and the strangling habit. On the forest floor we see an herbaceous erect plant, and when we look at the shape of the leaves, we see it's a pedate leaf with one big leaflet in the middle and 2 on each side. They have beautiful patches of silver, mostly at the top of each leaflet. Here, an infructescence, we see the fruit, and obviously this is an Arizema in the family Araceae. So what is a little bit strange is that usually Arizemas have only 1 or 2 leaves, mostly for the temperate species from Himalaya or Japan. But here in the equatorial zone, there are very few species of Arizema, and they have leaves always on the plant because all the Himalayan and temperate from China and Japan species have a tuber and they lose the leaves in winter, so have the dormant period. But the few species of tropical rainforest in the same genus Arizema have not at all resting period, and they have a longer tuber, but it's not at all a swollen tuber, it's just like a rhizome producing always new leaves. And in this case, for instance, this plant has 5 leaves or maybe 6 leaves. So instead of 1 or 2 leaves, the tropical Arizema have many leaves for one plant. So it's a totally different way of life, and maybe sooner or later it will be separated in another genus. So here I see very strange plants, strange because so wide leaf, and immediately when I see it, I think it's not at all a ground orchid, not at all a small pandan, but when I see the apex of the leaf, when I see the 2 vines here, I understand actually this is a sage and it is a Mapania, but I know many Mapania species in forest understory with wide leaves, but usually wide leaf means 2 or 3 centimeters. This one is probably 8 centimeters wide, so I can say I've never seen a Mapania with so wide leaves, but so it's probably the Cyperaceae with the widest leaves in forest understory, and even in the family Cyperaceae.
Ah, puis belle petit botaniste, Bordeaux. On dirait que presque il est rhéophyte.
Bah oui, bah il est, oui. Oui, ce pandanus growing exactly on the edge of the river with a strong current, so obviously this is a rheophytic species which is firmly anchored on the edge, on the banks of the fast-flowing river, and we see the stems and the roots growing inside, and the stem just above the water. So here along the trunk we see a climbing epiphytic Selaginella reaching many meters up to the Hedalchium, epiphytic Hedalchium. So it's a Selaginella which has the usual photosynthetic stems, and actually the stems are growing very thin all along the trunk and producing from place to place new flabellate shoots, assimilatory shoots. So it's a growth habit not so usual in the Selaginella species between climber and epiphytic. I don't know if it's Gesneriaceae or Urticaceae or Acanthaceae. At night like this is not so easy. I could say most probably maybe an Acanthaceae.
Oh, it's a beautiful flower, isn't it?
Yeah.
Vous pouvez la redresser.
The terminal inflorescence. I look, I'll try. There is very low light level now. Oh, it seems these are stipules. I'll check. Oh yes, it seems these are stipules, so probably it's a rubiaceae. The 2 elements.
Ah, yeah.
Wow. Again, we see the epiphytic edichium, never very high. It's usually between 4-5 meters and 10 meters in height along the tree trunk, so it remains what could be considered as an understory plant, but epiphytic, and there are not so many big epiphytes at this low height along the trunks. Here I see a plant climbing with leaves verticillate by 3 or 4. We see, for instance, a very young shoot here with 3 leaves. Venation is one main vine, and when I follow here, so I see the stem detached from the trunk, and we clearly see the verticillate leaves by 4, and I think really it's a Medinilla of the group of Medinilla radicans, which is climbing Medinilla. We can find under different forms from Vietnam to peninsular Malaysia, South Thailand, or even here in Borneo. In New Guinea, I've seen something similar, but this one is very elegant with the so long leaves. It looks a little bit like a fern. Il est belle.
Ouais.
All the deadlocks transported by the water during the rainy season. I'm surprised. I see here on the banks of the river this huge inflorescence. Obviously it's a grass, it's a poacea, but I'm very surprised to see the size of the inflorescence compared to the size of the leaves. So it's a plant. Yes, totally branched inflorescence. Wow.